Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The Aethon Meridian Station had been designed by a committee of 17 architects representing 9 different species, and it showed. The eastern residential ring smelled faintly of something that the Selenid members of the design team had considered pleasant, and that most other species experienced as aggressively botanical. The corridor lighting shifted color temperature every 4 hours in deference to the circadian preferences of whichever species had lobbied most effectively during the station's third renovation, which meant that at certain times of day, the hallways glowed a deep rose that made everyone look vaguely unwell regardless of their biology. The coffee, dispensed from machines on every level, had been calibrated to approximate the preferred stimulant beverage of 11 species simultaneously, and therefore fully satisfied none of them. It was, in other words, a place built from compromise, and it had the particular exhausted dignity of all things built from compromise, functional, occasionally beautiful in unexpected angles, and quietly aware that it was never going to please anyone completely. Rowan Callister arrived on a Tuesday, which the station observed on a rotating calendar that nobody had asked for, but which the human contingent of the administrative staff had installed during the second year of operations, and which had proven impossible to remove without causing a procedural incident. He came through the docking corridor with a single travel case, a briefcase that contained 14 months of other people's careful work, and the specific inner stillness of a man who has been keeping a secret for so long that it has become simply part of his interior architecture. Present the way load-bearing walls are present, not thought about, just holding things up. He was not a remarkable-looking person. This was something he had made a certain peace with over the years, and had eventually come to regard as a professional advantage. Trade negotiators were not supposed to walk into rooms and rearrange them. They were supposed to sit in rooms and wait, with genuine patience, until the room rearranged itself around the logic of what was possible. He was good at waiting. His supervisor at the Interplanetary Trade Commission had once described him as a closed door that is somehow still polite about it, and he had taken this as a compliment, which perhaps said something about him. The talks he had come to conduct were officially titled the Vaethran Human Commercial Alignment Sessions, which was the kind of name that told you everything about their importance and nothing about their difficulty. The Vaethran Corridor was a transit route through a region of space that both civilizations had been circling for 2 generations, like people trying to share a doorway without acknowledging they were doing it. 11 worlds, approximately 40 billion people. Tariff structures so layered with historical grievance that the ITC briefing documents came with a separate document explaining the first document. Rowan had read both on the transit over and had slept well afterward, which his colleagues found either admirable or concerning. He spent his first evening in his quarters on the 4th residential ring, reviewing notes he had already memorized and listening to recordings he had already absorbed so thoroughly that they played in his sleep, had been playing in his sleep for the better part of 2 years. The recordings were in Vaethari, the language of a species that the xenolinguistics community had classified, with a certain grim relish, as one of the 3 genuinely unlearnable languages in the catalogued galaxy, the others being a deep ocean species pressure-modulated communication, and something from the outer systems that linguists debated was even intentional. Vaethari required harmonic overtones on specific phonemes, tonal registers that carried meaning at frequencies that human vocal anatomy was, according to the literature, structurally incapable of producing. There was a word in Vaethari for the specific comedy of a non-native speaker attempting the language without sufficient tonal grounding. It translated, roughly, as the sound a good intention makes when it falls. Rowan had heard this word used to describe his own early attempts. He had found it accurate and had written it phonetically in his study notebook and used it as a benchmark. When he could pronounce it correctly, with all 3 of its required harmonic layers, he would know he was making progress. He could now pronounce it correctly. He had been able to for 7 months. He turned off the recordings at a reasonable hour and looked out his viewport at the gas giant the station used as an anchor, a massive thing banded in deep amber and rust, patient and indifferent in the way that only objects of planetary scale could manage. And he thought, as he had thought many times, that what he was planning for the opening session was either a significant diplomatic asset or a spectacular way to derail proceedings before they properly began. The line between those two outcomes was, in his assessment, a single pun. Specifically, a 400-year-old Vaethran trader's joke embedded in a word that meant two things simultaneously, depending on which tonal register you held on the second syllable. He had been practicing the second syllable for 6 months. He thought, ready. He turned off the light, and the amber glow of the gas giant came quietly through the viewport and filled the room, and he slept without difficulty, which was either the sign of a man at peace with his choices or a man who had simply stopped worrying about them, and he had long since stopped being sure which one applied to him. The morning of the opening session arrived the way important mornings always did on diplomatic stations, with an institutional punctuality enforced not by clocks, but by the lighting systems, which shifted from the soft amber of sleeping hours to the precise, slightly merciless brightness of official proceedings at exactly 700 hours. It was the architectural equivalent of someone removing a comfortable chair from a room. The message was clear. Pleasantries were over. The station meant business, even if business was the one thing that had not yet been formally established. Rowan dressed in gray, which was the color he wore to negotiations the way other people wore armor. He checked his briefcase once, not because he needed anything in it, but because the motion was familiar, and familiar motions were useful before unfamiliar situations. He stood at his viewport for exactly 2 minutes, watching the gas giant hold its position in the middle distance with the sublime indifference of something that had existed for 4 billion years and had no particular opinion about tariff classifications. Then he picked up his briefcase and went to meet the rest of his life's most interesting morning. Adesh was waiting outside the conference suite with 2 cups of station coffee and the expression of a man who had accepted the coffee's limitations and was drinking it anyway on purely pragmatic grounds. He handed one to Rowan without comment. They stood together in the corridor for a moment, and Adesh said that the Vaethran delegation had arrived at the suite 7 minutes early, which in Vaethran diplomatic protocol indicated either extreme eagerness or a low-grade territorial instinct, and that he had not yet determined which. Rowan said that they would find out shortly. Adesh said that he had reviewed his translation protocols and was fully prepared to render proceedings accurately in both directions. Rowan said that he appreciated this. There was a brief pause, and then Adesh added, with the air of someone completing a professional obligation, that he had also reviewed the ITC briefing on Vaethari phonology, and that the literature was unanimous in its position that human vocal anatomy could not produce the required harmonic tones, and that this was perhaps worth bearing in mind. Rowan said that he had read the same literature. Adesh looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had just noticed that the door he was standing next to was slightly warmer than the surrounding wall, and said nothing further, and they went inside. The conference suite was everything a room designed for the compression of political tension into signed documents needed to be. Neutral, well-lit, and furnished with the kind of careful blankness that was supposed to communicate impartiality, and instead communicated that the interior designer had been given instructions that actively prevented good taste. The table was long and pale. The chairs were ergonomically calibrated to accommodate 3 different skeletal configurations. The viewport offered the amber light of the gas giant, which was the one genuinely beautiful thing in the room, and which neither delegation would look at once proceedings began because looking at beautiful things during negotiations was considered a sign of insufficient focus. The Vaethran delegation was already seated. There were 4 of them, arranged with the quiet intentionality of people who understood that where you sat was itself a statement. Their translation specialist, a younger Vaethran with the slightly resigned posture of someone in a supporting role who takes their work seriously anyway, had his equipment arranged and active. And at the center of the Vaethran side of the table, with the stillness of someone who had arrived early specifically in order to have already decided how the room felt before anyone else entered it, was Vaelithra Sonn. Rowan looked at her the way you look at something you have prepared for extensively and which is still, in person, different from the preparation. She was watching him with the focused assessment of someone conducting a rapid and thorough evaluation and choosing not to be subtle about it, because subtlety in a first assessment was a form of dishonesty she apparently had no patience for. He respected this immediately. Coordinator Bren, the session chair, was arranging her documentation at the head of the table with the brisk competence of someone who had facilitated enough difficult negotiations to have stopped being impressed by their difficulty. She looked up, confirmed that both delegations were present, and drew breath to formally open proceedings. Rowan spoke first. He spoke in Vaethari. He used the commercial familiar register, held the harmonic undertone correctly on 3 consecutive phonemes, delivered the formal greeting with its layered simultaneous meanings intact, and then, before the greeting had fully settled in the air, shifted the second syllable of Vaethran Sonn by exactly the tonal degree required to activate its 400-year-old secondary meaning, and said that he was hoping this meeting would produce considerable Vaethran Sonn. And then, because a pun only half delivered was worse than no pun at all, added that he was hoping for both definitions at once. As he had been reliably informed, they were not mutually exclusive. The room did several things simultaneously. Coordinator Bren stopped mid-breath. Adesh studied the table with professional devotion. The Vaethran translation specialist looked at his equipment as though considering whether it had malfunctioned. And Vaelithra Sonn stared at Rowan Callister across the pale table, with the expression of someone whose prepared categories had just been handed something that did not fit any of them, and held that expression for 3 full seconds while comprehension moved visibly across her features. And then she laughed, a full and genuine sound with the faint harmonic quality that Vaethran voices carried even in ordinary speech, and it rang through the conference room with the particular resonance of something completely unplanned, which is always the loudest kind of sound in a room designed for the careful management of everything. The laughter lasted only a few seconds before Vaelithra recovered it, not suppressed it, which would have been the diplomatic instinct, but recovered it the way you recover something that has fallen and decide, consciously, to hold it differently rather than put it back where it was. She sat back in her chair with a small adjustment of posture that changed the entire character of her presence at the table, and she looked at Rowan with her gold-shifted eyes carrying something that had not been there 30 seconds ago, which was genuine curiosity uncomplicated by professional caution. She spoke in Vaethari, not at the room, not at Coordinator Bren, not at the middle distance where diplomatic statements are traditionally aimed, so that they can be walked back later, directly at Rowan, in the commercial familiar register with a tonal adjustment toward informal collegial that he recognized and noted and found, privately, encouraging. She used the Vaethran grammatical construction, reserved for questions to which the speaker has already been told the answer is impossible, and asked how a human being had learned to speak what her people had, with considerable comfort and a certain amount of strategic satisfaction, assumed was their exclusive communicative domain. Her translation specialist leaned forward slightly and began rendering this into standard. Vaelithra raised one hand, 4 fingers extended in the Vaethran gesture that meant approximately, "Thank you, that will not be necessary," and he stopped. He sat back with the expression of a man watching his professional purpose dissolve in real time and choosing to process this gracefully, which was admirable. Adesh, on Rowan's side of the table, had not even attempted to translate. He had instead produced a small paper notepad from his jacket, a relic from a previous posting that he kept out of either sentiment or contrariness, and was writing something with the focused calm of a man, removing himself from a situation he had correctly identified as no longer requiring him. Rowan answered in Vaethari. He told her about the 2 years. He told her about the Vaethran linguistic scholars in human space, emigrants, both of them, who had agreed to teach him with what he could only describe as a patience that bordered on the saintly, given that his early attempts at harmonic tonal production had apparently sounded. He used the Vaethari phrase for it, like machinery attempting music. He told her that he had decided, when first assigned to these negotiations 26 months ago, that routing everything through translation was a legitimate approach, and also, in his personal estimation, a way of communicating to the other party that you found the distance between you acceptable, that you were comfortable with the approximation. He had not been comfortable with the approximation. He was, he said, searching briefly for the right word and finding a Vaethari term that sat precisely between professionally motivated and unreasonably stubborn, some combination of both. Vaelithra listened to this, with her chin resting on one long-fingered hand, and the expression of someone watching something rare do something rarer. When he finished, she said that the 2 years clearly included substantial work on second-register tonal harmonics specifically, because his pronunciation in the commercial familiar was not merely functional. She used a Vaethari word that landed closer to arresting than to adequate, and that the pun had been executed with correct historical context, which implied source material beyond a standard language course, and that she was curious what else his briefing materials contained. Adesh slid his notepad across the table to Rowan without looking up. The note read, "I am aware I am no longer needed. I have taken the liberty of ordering coffee. I will bill for the full session." Rowan read it, nodded once, and slid it back. Adesh pocketed it with the dignity of a professional at complete peace with his circumstances. Coordinator Bren, who had been facilitating negotiations for 9 years, and had once managed a session in which the lead negotiators had spent the first 40 minutes in what turned out to be an improvised language neither delegation had used before, and which raised questions she had since chosen not to pursue, cleared her throat, and noted for the official record that both delegations had indicated willingness to proceed in Vaethari, that all formal documentation would be maintained in both Vaethari and standard per established requirements, and that proceedings would now continue accordingly. She said this with the particular tone of someone redefining the word, accordingly, to cover a broader range of events than it had previously been asked to manage. The formal agenda for the session occupied a document that Rowan had helped draft over 3 weeks, and which called for opening priority statements followed by preliminary framework discussion on tariff classifications in the 3 disputed commercial sectors. He had 19 prepared points. He delivered none of them. What happened instead, across the following 3 hours, was something the official record would describe as preliminary engagement, and which was, in actual texture, a conversation conducted entirely in Vaethari, moving between the agenda's formal topography and the more interesting country around it, occasionally circling back to something that required official language, and then leaving it again for somewhere more honest. He discovered that Vaelithra thought quickly and preferred directness even when dressed in ceremonial phrasing, and that she had a specific kind of humor that located the funny in the gap between what things claimed to be and what they were. She noted at one point, in a subordinate tonal clause that technically modified a statement about sector classifications, but functionally had nothing to do with it, that the conference table was clearly made of a synthetic material that had spent its entire existence trying to pass as wood, and he laughed before he could decide whether to, the involuntary kind, and she looked briefly pleased with herself, in a way she did not try particularly hard to conceal. Outside the viewport, the gas giant held its position with the patience of 4 billion years of uninterrupted existence, banded in amber and rust, utterly indifferent to tariff structures and harmonic tonal registers, and the specific quality of silence that falls in a room when two people who expected to be strangers discover, with some surprise, that they are something else. Inside, the session continued. The translation specialists sat with their equipment ready and their services unrequired. Coordinator Bren updated the official log at regular intervals, choosing her language carefully. And at the pale table, in the commercial familiar register that had shifted toward informal collegial and was continuing, incrementally, in the same direction, something was happening that neither delegation's briefing documents had anticipated, which is the only kind of thing that ever truly matters in a room built for negotiation. The agreement was signed on a Thursday, which the station calendar observed with the same arbitrary conviction it brought to all its days, and which meant nothing to the Vaethran delegation and everything to the three human administrative staff who had a running wager on which day of the week the talks would conclude. The one who had bet Thursday collected her winnings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had based her prediction entirely on intuition, and had decided afterward that this made it more impressive rather than less. The formal signing protocol lasted 40 minutes and involved a great deal of careful language that both delegations had negotiated into existence over the preceding 3 weeks, language that had started in briefing documents and ended somewhere different, revised by the particular friction of honest conversation into something more durable than either side had originally brought to the table. The Vaethran corridor would open in stages. Tariff structures would be reviewed at each stage. There were provisions in the final document that had not existed in any preliminary draft, having been arrived at in the middle of discussions about something else entirely, the way the best solutions tend to arrive. Trade analysts reviewing the agreement would later note that its comprehensiveness was unusual for a first-round negotiation, and would attribute this to various structural factors, none of which were the correct answer. Coordinator Bren closed the official record with the visible relief of someone who had spent 3 weeks quietly expecting catastrophe and was now processing its absence. She said it had been the smoothest major commercial session she had facilitated in 9 years. She used the word smoothly without qualification, which Rowan noted, and which he suspected Vaelithra noted also, because Vaelithra noticed most things. Adesh, who had attended every session and translated at approximately 4% of them, submitted his final documentation with complete professional correctness. He had also, Rowan discovered, kept notes, not the official kind, but a small running account in his paper notebook, in handwriting that was very small and very precise, of the session proceedings as experienced by a translation specialist with nothing to translate. The final entry, which Adesh showed him without explanation before pocketing the notebook permanently, read, Day 15. Rendered one subordinate clause into standard at the request of Coordinator Bren for procedural record. Felt briefly useful. The moment passed. The Vaethran delegation began their departure preparations in the early afternoon, moving with the organized efficiency of people who had done this many times and had a ship to catch, which was a feeling that transcended species lines entirely. Rowan completed his own documentation, filed the signed agreement through the ITC transmission system, and received within the hour a response from his supervisor that read, in its entirety, comprehensive, unexpected, well done. He read this 3 times because his supervisor had never previously used the word unexpected in a positive context, and he wanted to be certain of the tone. He decided it was positive. He filed it alongside the agreement. He was in the corridor outside the conference suite, case in hand, when Vaelithra found him. She had separated from her delegation with the ease of someone who does not require explanation for small divergences, and she stood in the amber-tinged corridor light. The gas giant was visible through the porthole at the far end, making its usual indifferent case for geological timescales, and she looked at him with the directness that he had stopped finding startling sometime around day 4, and had started finding, if he was being honest with himself, one of his favorite things about her. She said, in Vaethran, that she had a question she had been considering asking for approximately 11 days, and had decided that the departure window was the appropriate moment, which was either good timing or the last available timing, and she was willing to accept either characterization. He said that he was listening. She asked whether learning her language had been a strategic calculation or something else, and she used a Vaethran tonal construction that made clear she already had a hypothesis and was checking it against his answer, which was, he thought, exactly the kind of question she would ask. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He told her that it had begun as strategy and become, somewhere around month 8 when he had stopped being able to explain to himself why he was still doing it purely in professional terms, something else. That somewhere in the recordings and the sessions with his patient teachers, and the long evenings practicing a second syllable that refused to cooperate. He had stopped learning Vaethran as a tool and started learning it because the language itself had a quality he did not have a word for in standard, a kind of structural honesty. The way it carried multiple meanings simultaneously rather than forcing a speaker to choose one and abandon the others. He said that he thought it had changed how he thought about certain things, which was perhaps more than he had intended to share in a corridor, but that she had asked directly, and he found it difficult to answer her indirectly, which was possibly something she had done to him. She was quiet for a moment, which in Vaethran conversational rhythm meant she was taking the answer seriously. Then she said that in the Vaethran diplomatic continuance, there was a term for a negotiation that produced more than its stated objectives. A word that meant, in its full tonal range, something between surplus and gift, and that she intended to use it in her official report when characterizing these sessions, and that the committee reviewing her report would interpret this as a reference to the trade agreement's scope, which was technically accurate. Rowan said that he appreciated the precision. She said, already moving, that she had also entered his communication credentials into her personal records rather than the official diplomatic registry, which was a distinction her people made deliberately, and which he was free to interpret however the Vaethran language he had spent 2 years learning suggested he should interpret it. He stood in the corridor after her footsteps had rounded the far corner, with the gas giant filling the porthole in amber and rust, and he thought that the word she had just used, the one that meant surplus and gift simultaneously, had a secondary tonal inflection he had not fully explored yet. He thought that 2 years had been enough to have a conversation that mattered, and that whatever came next would require more. He found he did not mind this in the slightest. He picked up his case and walked toward the docking ring, and somewhere in the back of his mind the language was already running, looking for the word he needed, finding, as it generally did, that it contained more than one meaning at once.